So the measurement of economy during the war is really, really problematic. A lot of people talk about how Russian economy is growing, but it's actually very clear. You can see that it is just the military economy which is growing. The civilian sector is not. A Russian economy is under-measured, under-researched. A lot of data are now classified. There are some institutes which are very closely monitoring Russian economy. In particular, there is Bank of Finland Institute for Transition Economies who looks into this, which shows that if you look sector by sector, these are the military sectors which are growing, being paid and prepaid by the government. So it's not surprising. Of course, these sectors contribute to measured GDP, but this measured GDP has nothing to do with economic performance for ordinary Russians. Because you buy a tank, it looks like value is created, the tank producers get paid, but then this tank burns next week in Ukraine. And so it's completely equivalent to a situation where you just print this money and hand it to tank producers without anything produced. And so it looks like the value is actually not created, but official statistics counts it as economic growth.
Well, it's great to see you again, Sergei. I remember the first time I actually met you was there in Paris, and I was living in Berlin at the time and flew over, and I think we were supposed to have coffee for breakfast around in the morning time, but that didn't work out, and I think you squeezed me in sometime in the afternoon. I think you still gave me coffee, I believe, but yeah, it's really good to see you here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, some of your background and some of the work you've been doing, particularly recently?
Right. I'm Sergei Guriev. I'm an academic economist. At some point, I was running a university in Russia, the New Economic School. At some point, we disagreed with the Russian government, and so I had to buy a one-way ticket. I left Russia and indeed landed in Paris. I got a job at Sciences Po economics department as a professor of economics. And since 2013, I've been a faculty member in Sciences Po. I took actually a leave of absence between 2016 and 2019, where I worked here in London, at European Bank for Reconstruction and Development as a chief economist. In this capacity, I've learned a lot about policymaking, not just in Russia. At that point, Russia was already not an active country of operation. After 2014, EBRD stopped doing new business in Russia. But in many countries around the world, EBRD works in 40 countries in Europe, Asia, and Northern Africa, now moving into Sub-Saharan Africa. So, and then I came back to academia in 2019. Then I became again professor of economics. In 2022, I was appointed provost at Sciences Po, so I was in charge of teaching and research in Sciences Po until this year. Actually, a few weeks ago, I came to London as the 10th Dean of London Business School, and again, a professor of economics. As an academic, I work on the use of information by populists and autocrats. And we look with different co-authors, we look into the strategies of postmodern propaganda, as we call it, with my co-author Daniel Treisman, by autocratic leaders who want to manipulate information and deceive citizens rather than frighten them into the submission. So our argument is that modern autocrats are actually different from their 20th century predecessors who openly used repression and were proud to be non-democratic leaders. Today's autocrats are more likely than not pretend to be Democrats, pretend to win elections, well, free and fair elections. They pretend them to be free and fair. And actually hide the fact that they use propaganda and censorship. Now, we also work on populists. We also work on disinformation, fact-checking with different co-authors, strategies to stand up to populist disinformation and misinformation. So this is my area of research, use of information by various enemies of liberal democracy and how we can stand up to this.
Yeah, it's super fascinating that you've done this as an economist. Can you say a little bit more about the way that your training as an economist has helped in the study of propaganda and the study of information by autocratic regimes?
Yes, there is a certain convergence among different social sciences. Some of the work we are doing, for example, on fact checking and misinformation on social media, false news on social media, is also done by political scientists, is also done by social psychologists, all from different angles. Economists use somewhat different methods, sometimes very sophisticated structural econometric models. But overall, the idea is there is a convergence of methodologies, convergence of research questions with somewhat different angles. I'm actually proud of having worked with various social scientists. My work on non-democratic regimes is in co-authorship with Daniel Trisman, who's a political scientist. And there, of course, the idea is sustainability and durability of non-democratic regimes depends on their capacity of running their economy competently, because they want to pretend to be competent, popular leaders. And for that, they need cash to bribe the elites, to pay the censors, to co-opt media owners, but at the same time, leave enough money in the fridges of citizens. So whenever citizens look at their fridge, they don't see big divergence between the reality and the message conveyed by the propaganda. So economy is a big part of survival of modern autocrats. It's actually a very famous scholar of non-democratic regimes, Adam Przeworski, famously said that authoritarian equilibrium is based on three pillars: fear, lies, and economic prosperity. And since modern dictators are more likely to shy away from using open repression, they do use repression, but in a hidden, limited, targeted, and deniable way. Lies, that's something that we mentioned, and economics are very important instruments. And in our work with Daniel Trisman, we actually published papers in economics journals, but also in political science journals. And we looked at how economic outcomes help non-democratic leaders to continue to stay popular and continue to stay in power. But it's not just economics and political science, not just economics and social psychology. I've worked on law and economics. I've worked on economic history. I worked on issues like trust, interpersonal trust, and trust in government. And so in that sense, you see amazing convergence where we need to talk to sociologists, we need to talk to legal scholars, we need to talk to social psychologists, we need to talk to historians, and we learn from each other. We learn from each other a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously super complicated to being able to draw all this together. This is something you mentioned there that it's kind of really intrigued me about your work in particular, is the role of fact checking. Particularly, you've worked on this about and there has been for a while this this sense of trying to think that fact checking was going to save us in some way. And there's obviously implicit understandings of truth and what role truth and facts play in our politics. And I think this might be a good example, or this is a question for you, whether it's do you see this as a good example of how stuff that you're doing in the information environment is informing political economy, economic analysis, and then also it seems on the other side, the forms of the methodological insights and kind of approaches you do, kind of bringing it over more into an informational side that can sometimes be much more qualitative in assessment. I guess, this is more of a question just to you, could you say a little bit more about the role of fact checking then in kind of trust, which you just mentioned, also what role it does. Does it actually work? When we fact check an autocrat, or we do it maybe even in a democratic, I know you've done this in the US and French context as well. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Jonathan, this is a great question. And this is where, indeed, being an economist, I look at this issue slightly differently. Economists take into account costs and benefits. And of course, fact checking is an instrument which is not free. It's quite costly. in all kinds of ways. First, the fact checkers are highly skilled individuals who need to be funded. And when we talk about policy advice on fact checking, we need to remember that indeed there is a social cost in undertaking fact checking. Most of these organizations are NGOs or media organizations which have difficult time finding resources. Sometimes social media platforms fund their activities, and we definitely see that there is not enough money for fact-checking provided by social media platform companies. But even if we step out of this, fact-checking is also costly for users of social media platforms. So basically, if I need to read fact-checking, that's an additional cost. And it's what we show in our work. It seems to be much costly from a point of view of mental energy. We show that each additional click is costly, but it's also mental energy to think about the fact checking is also costly. And what we show, sometimes it's easier just to ask people to think themselves without having to read fact checking. The nudge to think about accuracy and veracity of posts may make wonders. This is not only us who do that. Social psychologists have done meta-analysis of those studies of veracity nudges and accuracy priming, and that works beautifully. So I don't ask you to read the fact checking. I just ask you, can you think before sharing this stuff? Can you think if it's actually true? And when people avoid knee-jerk reaction to social media activity and they reflect for some time, they actually are much more likely to share true news and much less likely to share false news, which is what we want. We don't want to reduce the overall sharing. Why? Because we do want people to benefit from dissemination of true information. And if we impose too much cost on social media activity, the benefits of social media, which are real, would be thrown away with the bathwater.
Well, so I mean, this is super interesting in that, like, it's the mere presence of, like, on the screen that there might be some fact checking. You're saying, like, oh, someone actually doesn't need to go. It's this framing device of saying someone just needs to be reminded that there are these things out there called facts that what they're reading may or may not cohere with, and just having that does enough. And I guess it kind of leads me to wonder: can we just, like, put empty fact checking, like, boxes on the social media? Does that do the same? Or is it like, does it actually have to be there? So it's like, potentially I could go find out more information? Or is it just like could Facebook create a banner to say, remember facts?
Well, yes and no. Of course, in our experiments, we need to get ethics committee approval. So we never lie to our users. This is also different across disciplines, but in economics, you cannot get IRB approval, the committee approval, if you lie to your survey participants. And so there has to be fact checking. If we say, if you click on this, you will see the fact checking. And as you said, people who see that this was fact check actually trigger reflective process in their mind. And 60% don't click. And yet they update their beliefs about veracity of these things, even without updating. 40% click and read the fact check. But even if you just give them a health warning, like you see on cigarette packs or on alcohol bottles, saying, look, remember that there is false news circulating on social media. That's it. I don't even need to give you the link saying you can click on this and fact check. I just can give you this warning like you see on cigarette packs. Everybody knows cigarettes are not healthy, and we still keep printing those health warnings. Maybe indeed those messages, the warnings, the reminders can do a good job. And right now already on social media, if you want to share an article you don't read, you see the reminder. Maybe, Jonathan, you should read the stuff you want to share before you share. So those reminders can actually help, and we are already see social media using this. I would say in one of our papers we did an experiment on Facebook in French 2019 elections, And then while writing this paper, we saw Twitter doing certain things in May 2020 with the Donald Trump's Twitter account. And our results were very much consistent. So our recommendations how to reduce sharing of false news were very much consistent with what Twitter would do in terms of warnings and additional click requirements in May 2020 with Donald Trump. So in order to see Donald Trump's tweet about looting, about BLM protests, Twitter said, look, this is an important tweet, but it glorifies violence. We want you to be able to see this tweet, but you need to think about this. And if you want to see it, you need to have an additional click. And that per se in our study shows that that would reduce sharing of this particular tweet, something like by a factor of 4.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, just to maybe segue this to something that you and Peter definitely know much better than I do about the use of fact checking in Russia. One thing that we saw last month in Filter's analysis of Kursk was this use there of kind of the Kremlin pushing out a campaign to warn people in Kursk, where the offensive was happening, to watch out for these disinformation campaigns of Ukrainians there. And I guess I'm kind of wondering whether or not what's going on there? How do we understand this as is it all of a sudden weaponized fact checking there? And is this something that the Kremlin and, its information apparatus has done regularly? Is this something new there?
I think Peter knows better. In 2022, I actually looked into disinformation and misinformation during the war. And I can tell you that we tried to identify pieces of news which were incorrect every week from both sides. And there was a lot on both sides. Sometimes intentional, sometimes not intentional. There is a difference between disinformation and misinformation. People are very easily tricked by a video, which may be a fake video or misrepresented video. Right now, you also have deep fakes. So during the war, both sides use a lot of false information, again, intentionally or not intentionally. And in that sense, fact-checking is important. And of course, unfree regimes may weaponize fact-checking, trying to benefit from that. So this is completely normal. But famously, I think it was Clausewitz who said that there is a fog of war. By definition, information changes quickly, and by definition, you don't get the up-to-date view of what's actually going on the battleground. So, of course, both misinformation and fact-checking are part of the overall toolkit of the, say, Russian government machine.
It's very interesting how generally, once the fact-checking and counter-disinformation movement started in the West, partly as a response to what Russia was doing, they took that language and that brand and used it very quickly themselves and said, no, everything from the West is disinformation, and we're going to do the real fact check. And sometimes, that there is a fog of war, and they might, land on something, a genuine piece of disinformation. That is possible, but generally I felt it was just about kind of nullifying that language. You do it, we do it. The same as Russia has human rights NGOs, which do human rights analysis of European countries to sort of create an equality in order to just rubbish the whole concept, which is what they like to do. But it was interesting that in the various strategies they used to try to deal with the Kursk incursion, that's one of the ones they landed on. And I wonder why. I wonder why they thought that would be a relevant one, because it doesn't exactly sort of inspire belief in the Russian response. It just makes people feel even more uncertain. I don't know. What have they been trying to achieve in the wake of the incursion?
I would say it's a very new phenomenon when Russia proper, Russia pre 2019, 2014 borders have been invaded, and since it's so unprecedented and unexpected, Russian public may actually be more susceptible, vulnerable towards Ukrainian misinformation, disinformation campaigns. So Russian government at least believes so, that Russians may actually know that, well, part of Kursk region is invaded. And if Ukraine says we are already 10 kilometers away from Kursk, they will believe it as well, because the previous piece of news was also quite unusual. And there was a fake picture that showed the Ukrainian soldiers near a road sign saying that it's just 10 kilometers to Kursk, right? And this is a typical picture that Russian government had to fact check to avoid massive panic. The same thing about Kursk nuclear plant, nuclear power plant, right? So again, to avoid panic, you need to do something to fact check those news.
It was striking about how like unprepared Russia was in this, and it feels like this was somewhat exceptional. Obviously, last summer with Prigozhin's rebellion, I don't know how prepared any country is for one of their like militia leaders to turn against them in some way, but it seems like they've been somewhat of like in control, or at least nothing is terribly surprising to them a lot. I mean, from your two vantage point, is that a fair assessment of Russia here, or are they doing a very good job pretending they understand like nothing is surprising them and this was just too surprising and so they couldn't really cover it up, or people who are kind of watching this reaction could tell it wasn't quite right?
I think Prigozhin's risk attitudes are very different from ours, right? So he knew this is a very dangerous bet, and we saw that. Well, there are conspiracy theories that Prigozhin's still alive, but in this reality where we are now, Prigozhin was killed by Putin, and this was completely expected. And so for him, it was a bet that he's taken. It was a very, very risky bet, and probably other generals would not want to repeat this game. Talking about the invasion into the Kursk region, this is something which is completely natural. Russia's army has been destroyed in the first few months of the war. The professional army was destroyed. Now Russia is struggling to find new soldiers, and I think the best indication, putting on my economist hat, I can tell you that if you see higher prices for recruiting soldiers, that means soldiers don't want to come. That means there is a shortage of men. And we see that the price for bringing in new men to the front line is going up and is very high by now. And so that shows there are no volunteers, no soldiers. You need to spend a lot of money. And so you don't have extra soldiers to protect all your borders. And, one of the results of this anti-NATOization campaign was actually Finland has a huge border with Russia now, and Finland is a NATO member. So if NATO wants to invade Russia, I'm sure that Russia is completely unprepared to defend Russian-Finnish border. There is no question about this. And I think the fact that Finland's not invading is the best proof that NATO's never wanted to invade Russia. But Ukraine did want to show that Russians are unprepared and did prove this theorem, if you like. So Russia didn't expect that, but it's also the fact that Russia doesn't have enough soldiers to. Russia doesn't have enough soldiers to protect itself alongside the whole border.
So, Sergei, I wanted to ask something in your study of like the way these sort of dictatorial or authoritarian systems react to threats through economics and through information control or disinformation. What is their vulnerability? Because looking at it from the side, we're tracking on Filter Labs, we're constantly tracking how the Russian propaganda system reacts to issues. And it usually reacts. I mean, they might struggle to stay on top of a topic like people's concerns about inflation or salaries, but they do react, which shows that the system has an immunity. It sees something, it sees people complaining about, salaries as compared to inflation. They react. They struggle to keep the sentiment, but they're mobile. So that for me says, okay, they're dealing with the issue. Maybe not successfully always, but they're dealing with it. But it seems to me that what they're not very good at is when something very new appears suddenly, a Prigozhin thing, a Kursk incursion. So it's not even that they have a weak spot. It's the system is actually, it tries to be maneuverable, but it's not as maneuverable as it would like. Is that what you're seeing as well? And what are the other moments where they get caught flat-footed? I mean, Prigozhin is such an obvious one, and we all saw that. The whole system went into paralysis. But do we see that often? Are there things they get caught out on?
So economists are good in looking at statistics, at data sets with many observations. By definition, the question you're asking about is for qualitative scholars, because these things happen very rarely. And by definition, we study the past statistics, the data set with many observations, see what's happened. Now, when unexpected things happen, by definition, I cannot really tell you how the system would react. Now, one thing which political scientists know very well is when you study all the regime changes, when you study all the coup attempts, you see that these are usually unexpected, and they may happen very quickly. Some of the most powerful regimes disintegrated very, very quickly, and this is what's making those regimes fragile, because there is a tipping point. Once tipping point is achieved, suddenly nobody wants to defend the regime. And I should say that in the hindsight, we believe that Prigozhin was destined to lose, but he could have won. He could have won. Basically, the coups like this function that you start the march and suddenly everybody joins you during your march in Moscow, and suddenly there is nobody to defend Moscow. And that's what Prigozhin was commenting on. You rightly said that the system went into paralysis. Nobody spoke in favor of Putin. We didn't see people going on YouTube saying, I'm going to defend Putin no matter what with my life and my family and whatever. We didn't see that. People were waiting for the winner. But overall, this is this idea of tipping point is and fragility is exactly what characterizes those systems, those non-democratic systems, because they are trained for something and they cannot handle black swans.
But they must be thinking of their own vulnerabilities all the time as well. And okay, both from your personal insight, but also from the statistics, can we understand from how they point their economic levers and their propaganda levers what they care about the most? I mean, I don't know, single factory towns, regional tensions, inter-regional budgetary flows. Can we see from their behavior what they really obsess about?
So we see from your work what they worry about, and you see the distinction between coverage of various topics in the official media and social media tells you something, what they want to let be communicated and what they want to censor really harshly. And I think no non-democratic regime wants protests in the capital city. That's where the regime change happens. And in that sense, it's not just an informational tool, it's also an economic tool. Whatever you do, you take soldiers from smaller places, not from the capital city. Whatever you do, make sure that restaurants in Moscow are open and functioning well, right? So you create this image of normality in the big city, in the capital city, because once you have the protests in Moscow, it's much harder to handle. Then the other issue is, of course, loyalty of the riot police. So Putin has a giant riot police. He could have sent hundreds of thousands of people to Ukraine or to Kursk. He doesn't. He needs those hundreds of thousands of riot police in Russia. And these people are well paid, and that's an important part of the regime. You mentioned regional separatism and ethnic tensions. This is also very important, because if you have ethnic tension somewhere in a non-Russian region, it's much harder to handle as well, because if the whole ethnicity understands it's insulted, discriminated against, suppressed, you may just lack the police power to suppress this movement, as Putin has seen in Chechnya. Chechen wars actually formed Putin's psyche as much as the macroeconomic meltdown did in 1998. So you ask me how the system is prepared. Putin has learned that when the system goes bankrupt, you're humiliated, you need to ask the best for money, and you lose popularity. So whatever he does, he tries to fight inflation, he tries to maintain conservative macroeconomic policy. Why? Because he wants to avoid the 1990s and especially 1998 turmoil. So he's learned certain things like this, and this is what he is prepared for. And he's invested a lot in this system which handles macroeconomic risks.
Can we? I'd like to talk a little bit more about like how we kind of understand the Russian economy right now. Like, what's the reality here? I mean, as you know, we've been tracking a lot of this stuff and trying to understand it, whether it's on the economic and kind of getting down to regional economic statistics or things that are going on just more kind of broadly around that. Was like, like we have seen complaints. You see more reports, both like the Russian central bank talking about inflation and things like that. And I guess what I'm interested particularly is like those like pain thresholds. That like, what are they actually? Do they have like a target? They're like, oh, we can't go above that sort of thing. Like, obviously in the US and, in Europe as well, we have like a target where we want inflation to be. When it gets too high, there's, what we're doing, in the United States and in Europe, keeping interest rates. And there's kind of this understanding there. But I guess I don't even understand like, where's our like really top threshold there? I mean, do you have a sense of that? Like where that would be, like, where's that danger zone that he's absolutely going to stay out of on that?
So it's not clear at all, and it's not clear that inflation is measured well. And I'll talk about this. I think this is an issue which is not well understood. The target exists, and the target is 4% per year, but inflation is way above the target. And basically, the goal of the central bank is that the measured inflation doesn't get out of control, in the sense that it doesn't accelerate. And so as long as it's single digits, it's okay. Each additional rate hike is costly for the real sector, especially for the civilian sector. The military sector gets prepaid by the government. So it's the civilian sector that has to pay a higher cost of capital. And so these people complain. These people really, really complain to the government. And whenever the central bank needs to raise interest rates, it gets criticized by the rest of the government, of course. But I think the pain level is probably double-digit measured inflation. Now, talking about the measured inflation, so the measurement of economy during the war is really, really problematic. A lot of people talk about how Russian economy is growing, but it's actually very clear. You can see that it is just the military economy which is growing. The civilian sector is not. Russian economy is under-measured, under-researched. A lot of data are now classified. So there are now papers based on leaked data. There are some institutes which are very closely monitoring Russian economy. And in particular, there is Bank of Finland, Institute for Transition Economies, who looks into this, which shows that if you look sector by sector, these are the military sectors which are growing, being paid and prepaid by the government. So it's not surprising. Of course, these sectors contribute to measured GDP, but this measured GDP has nothing to do with economic performance for ordinary Russians, because you buy a tank it looks like value is created. The tank producers get paid, but then this tank burns next week in Ukraine. And so it's completely equivalent to a situation where you just print this money and hand it to tank producers without anything produced, right? And so if you adjust for this, it looks like the value is actually not created, but official statistics counts it as economic growth. Now, this is one issue. The other issue is inflation. So usually inflation should be adjusted for quality of goods. This is extremely hard to do. But quality doesn't change very fast, except for in places like in Russia. Russians would normally, before 2022, buy and drive European cars. Some produced in Europe, some produced in Russia. Now, the average car is actually a Chinese car, right? So there's huge substitution by Chinese cars. For Russian official statistics, it's a car. So it's very hard to measure the quality differential. The problem is you can actually look at the quality differential by checking how much in Europe or in China or in Japan or in Korea the price differential is between Chinese and German car, and how it was in Russia before 2022. And the factor was factor of 1.5 or 2. And the fact that now you can buy a Chinese car at the price of a German car, for official statistics, same price, one car. What's not to like? But actually, it is equivalent to the increase of the prices by factor of 1.5 or 2. And there is some work on this. There was a long read by the economic journalist in The Bell, which is an independent online economic business media. They actually went car by car, make by make, trying to see, okay, there are still some Peugeots in Russia. How much do you pay for the same Peugeot relative to 2021? And the answer is twice as much, right? And so how much do you pay for the Chinese car of the same make relative to 2021? And it's, again, 60% increase. And so official statistics doesn't capture that. But the fact that you used to have majority of German cars and now you have majority of Chinese cars, the price per car doesn't change. But the price per unit of quality has increased dramatically. And so this mismeasurement actually matters a lot. And people don't talk about this, but this is hidden inflation, which is not captured, which of course also creates this tendency of complaint of Russians, which you capture through your sentiment measures. Russians are unhappy, they complain about higher prices, and they are right. Inflation is actually higher than the measured inflation by Russian Statistics Agency and by the central bank.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fun things that always jumps out at me when I look at the sort of the Filter Labs data is like you have spending in auto services recovering. It dipped really strongly after the war, and then you see it recovering, but you see the sentiment, going down, like not following the spending. Whenever I see spending going up but sentiment not, it shows me that something's wrong. And if somebody were to sort of start a properly kind of like subversive media into Russia, I would just start with a big car show. Just like, none of this stuff about like, rights or even, what's happening to the soldiers. Sadly, there seems to be an immunity, shall we say, within Russian society to care too much about that. But talking just a show about cars, just honest stuff about cars and what people feel, I think would have a deeply emotional resonance within Russian society, and it's so symbolic. The war was meant to bring pride and glory and status and superiority, but you don't feel very superior when you're driving a Chinese car that breaks down in the snow all the time. It's sort of
I wouldn't be too negative on Chinese cars. It's just they used to be twice as cheap, and indeed cars are a good measure because you can actually compare like for like. This is the same engine, the same class of cars, so this is much easier to compare. I'll give you this example. In Soviet times, Soviet Union produced Ladas, even exported Ladas. And you could use the price within Russia as a measure for value added, for GDP. And that's exactly what Soviet GDP was consisting of. But to what extent the price of Lada within Soviet Union was actually a good measure? And our European colleagues, in particular Finnish colleagues, would say, actually, when you look at exported Ladas, there you could actually compare Ladas and Mercedeses or Peugeots, and you could see that Lada is, again, twice as cheap or 3 times as cheap in a competitive market, which gives you the right price, the right measure of quality of this gun. I'll give you another example. So it's very hard to measure quality of weapons. I was recently writing a survey of Russian and Soviet economic history, and one of the puzzles is how good and how important was Soviet weapons export sector. And there are no quantitative data, but qualitative data say African countries would buy Soviet military jets in the ratio of 8-1 when they bought one British jet. So given how much Soviet jets would break, you need 8 of them to replace one British jet because you need to cannibalize, right? And so again, this is something that gives you a good measure. And unfortunately, we don't have good statistical data on this, but we have anecdotes like this.
Can you just connect some dots for me here a little bit? Like, we're talking about these things that are like, are they just like niggling issues that people get on and complain about? And like, how does that connect with, support for regime? And it kind of goes back to, I think, a question that Peter set up a little bit. Like, you've got this, like you can say in one way you have like this like fragility that's increasing, that's making more vulnerable, or you could just say like more little annoyances every day. I've got a cheaper car, but I still have a car. I can still go someplace. Life is still possible. I'm just kind of like wondering, like, is there an additive effect of all this? And particularly in like how you've, some of the work you've done on some of these very unstable areas, like, well, what's the role of all of these things that, we track and we're kind of like tracking it. And sometimes like it's super interesting, of course, to like see this stuff, and people all over the world, in media, everyday kind of consumers, policymakers are all interested in it. But it's kind of like, what does it all add up to? And is there? What do you think the role is? Is this just like little stuff they're going to like deal with, or these things that we're going to see Putin and the Kremlin try to address because they see it as somewhat, destabilizing?
So we don't know. It's indeed a story of a tipping point. So it's accumulating slowly and steadily until it breaks. And so we don't know when it breaks. And there is an issue here, which is the issue of coordination. So independent media plays a very important role in democratic countries, not just communicating the information about state of the economy, state of the society, but also communicating information about beliefs. So I may be unhappy about my country, but media will also tell me if I'm alone or everybody else is also unhappy. And in an authoritarian country, I'm unhappy about the economy and the direction of the country's trajectory, but I'm not sure I'm alone or not, and if I show up in the street, whether I'll be joined by millions or not. And this is the point of informational policy, of censorship and propaganda, convincing unhappy people that they're alone unhappy people, and they will not be joined by other unhappy people, so that everybody supports the regime. And everybody knows the regime is not really popular, but nobody knows by how much. To go to the street, you need to brave the repression. And so this calculus depends on how many extremely unhappy people there are in the society. And this is very, very hard to measure.
Yeah, can I just push a little bit on this here? And it's like, it kind of feels like, what are you unhappy about and how serious that is, right? And such that, like, is complaining about your car serious enough? Or is there like getting enough of those little complaints that it becomes bigger? I guess it's kind of like, I don't think we're going to likely see, people spilling into the streets, over these issues. And those are some issues where maybe the Kremlin does let people like complain about things. There's a pressure release. They're not going to like completely seal it down there because they don't think this is going to really destabilize anything. But then there are these other things perhaps that like, maybe the Kremlin cares about there. And what are those that they're going to repress? Because they're actually really worried like that's going to like lead to not just one person going out in the street corner, which, maybe they can ignore or they can arrest, or there's a variety of ways they can, kind of solve that problem to some extent from their vantage point. But I guess what are those issues and, that they wouldn't want, people complaining about?
So we don't know, but we can indeed judge by the revealed preference what Kremlin spends money on. So the Kremlin does invest in the repressive apparatus, so making sure, and in censorship, making sure that people don't take to the street over simple issues. The Kremlin avoids mobilization. This is very important, right? Mobilization could be a cheaper way to recruit soldiers. The Kremlin doesn't want to do it because it will probably be very unpopular. Even given the incursion in Kursk region, the Kremlin doesn't want to do mobilization. The Kremlin is against mobilization. The Kremlin also needs to make sure that every member of the elite is both scared and sufficiently happy, satisfied with the status quo. Right? Prigozhin was unhappy, and see what happened. So we need to make sure that there are no other Prigozhins. They are either eliminated before the opportunity to take up arms, or they are given whatever they need to be given. And so this is the difficulty of running a country like this, because you have limited amount of resources. You need to spend them on hiring soldiers, on giving ministers enough cash so they are happy. And yet you need to make sure that people drive some cars and have some food in the fridge. And Russia is not a poor country, actually. Russia is now classified as a high-income country. We are not going to see famine, that's for sure. But then Russians are getting tired of this war and are asking why, what for? And actually, if you look at independent polls, which are also very unreliable because Russians don't want to pick up the phone, Russians don't want to talk to some strangers. Still, you see a lot of sentiment of preferring some kind of peace, some kind of settlement, some kind of stopping the war, some kind of removing sanctions. This is, I guess, what your instruments are picking up as well.
If there is one thing, because everyone's talking about, potential negotiations after the election in the US, which could be of various forms, but let's say from Russia's point of view, as they look at their economic map and their vulnerabilities, what is the one thing they'll ask for in negotiations? Is it getting rid of the oil cap? Is it letting the central bank, trade again? What is the one thing that they would want to make their vulnerability less vulnerable?
So right now there is a very important squeeze from China. So only half of the world imposed sanctions on Russia, and China has a huge border with Russia, and China has not joined sanctions. But many Chinese players are now aware of the threat of secondary sanctions. And many Russian counterparts understand that we used to circumvent those sanctions through trading with Chinese partners. It was actually quite legal. But by now, Chinese players, big Chinese banks, start to get phone calls from the Treasury, US Treasury, and they don't want to pay. And they don't want to accept even yuans from Russia, right? Not even talking about dollars, right? And so that is not a sanction. It's a threat of secondary sanctions. I think Russians would really want to have this returning to the status quo of 2023, the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, where the trade with China was more or less free. So this is one of the most painful things. Of course, they want to remove oil sanctions. Of course, they want to get back central banks' reserves. But just freezing the conflict is not going to help Russia to remove sanctions. Sanctions were introduced for breaking the international law, so the West will ask to go back to at least to pre-2022 borders and possibly pre-2014 borders. So these are going to be very difficult negotiations, of course.
But then, what motivation do they have to stop, bombing Ukraine's, electricity infrastructure? They're going to ask for something.
Well, if Ukraine has enough air defense capacity to protect cities and electricity infrastructure, and if Ukraine has enough weapons to bomb Russian infrastructure, then it will be in Russia's interest just to freeze the conflict. Because again, Russia is running low on men, Russia is running low on cash. So these conversations that Russia will be low on cash already mid-2025 and certainly mid-2026 are quite realistic, because the liquid part of Russian National Welfare Fund is shrinking and can hit zero in 2025. Russia is now increasing taxes substantially, which didn't happen before, because Putin sees that he's running low on cash. So these are not trivial factors. And Ukraine doesn't have many soldiers, but Russia has to pay a lot to soldiers, and it's running low on resources that allow Russia to get better soldiers.
Wow, that's kind of a sobering assessment here. But just as we conclude here, are there any final thoughts on just like how we should understand, or what are some guiding kind of heuristics you would recommend to us who are trying to do it through a lot of like diverse types of data, or people out there who are listening and who would kind of are trying to figure out what's going on?
Well, I think you're doing a very important job. We didn't get to talk about this. I mentioned that one indication of what Russian government is worried about is the gap between official media and social media. Social media are censored, self-censored, but still they're much freer than official media, which is just the propaganda line. And so this divergence, this gap between what is discussed on social media and what is promoted on propaganda media is already quite informative. Overall, capturing the sentiment and looking at where the sentiment is more anxious and negative, which regions of Russia, also tells you about vulnerabilities. And I'm sure Russian government is trying to do the same thing, monitoring social media region by region, sector by sector, occupation by occupation. So for them, it's also an issue. And I think this is a very important measure, because unfortunately polls are no longer very informative. Russians are scared to pick up pollsters' calls, and they're right. If we have a conversation like this, like we are having today, within Russia, all of us will probably go to jail for 10 years.
Well, thank you very much for your time here. It's been, and it's obviously, great to hear your perspective on the work we're doing here. But as to return the favor, how can people follow you and hear more about your work? What would be the ways that they could, kind of get to know your work, as also where you're kind of engaging with people?
Well, I do have a Twitter account. I do have a YouTube channel, but I'm much less active since I've become a dean of London Business School. It's just a very busy job. It's an excellent institution, and I owe all my time to this institution. So on my Twitter account, I'll be tweeting more about business education than about Russia. So I think it's a very exciting challenge, and I'm really happy that I'm in this office. But probably people who are interested in the internal dynamics of Putin's regime should subscribe to Filter Labs and not to my Twitter account.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a really wonderful conversation with you. And I, for my part, have learned a lot from hearing both of you talk. So thanks for your time. And we will look forward to continuing the conversation another time.
Thank you.